Hey, welcome to Chapter 38, Plant Reproduction and Development. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to use examples to explain the concept of alternation of generations. You should be able to describe the function of gametophyte structures in angiosperms, describe how flowers are adapted to being pollinated by animals or wind, explain how seeds transformed plant reproduction. Okay, so a lot of plants have the ability to reproduce asexually by making genetically identical copies. So those are basically genetic clones of the parent. So there's tons of different ways of doing this. Some plants have rhizomes, which are underground stems like this that can produce new individual plants. So if you just were looking above the ground, you just see a plant come up and another plant and another plant, and then the stem underground is connecting them, and then you could separate these and make them into new plants. A corm, it looks a little bit like a bulb, but it's a bit different. It is a modified stem rather than a bunch of modified leaves, and you can see it forms these little tiny baby corms off to the side, and those can be planted. Some plants have plantlets, so some succulents will make little babies off the edges of the adult plant, and then those will fall on the ground and grow. Something like a dandelion. So if you've ever noticed a dandelion, if you go pull that dandelion out of the ground when it's still yellow, it will form all of these seeds without apparently being alive or getting fertilized, and that's because a dandelion is producing these seeds asexually. So that is actually asexual reproduction as well. All right, do you remember this?
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
All right, gametophytes make gametes by mitosis. Gamete plus gamete equals zygote. Zygotes grow up to be sporophytes. Sporophytes make spores by meiosis, and spores grow up to be gametophytes. Gametophytes make what?
Gametes.
By
Mitosis.
All right, Bird, you do the next one.
Gamete plus gamete equals zygote.
Yep. All right, Cat.
Zygotes grow up to be sporophytes, and then sporophytes make spores by meiosis.
Yep. And then over there in the corner, spores grow up to be gametophytes. All right, so you remember alternation of generations. We talked about how this works with flowers a little bit already, and we're going to dig in and again, cover some of the more finer details of angiosperm reproduction in this chapter. All right, so let's just trace the cycle through. So here is our sporophyte, that's a flower. Sporophytes make spores by meiosis. And so these are plants that are heterosporous. So what's that mean?
That means they got the small spores and the big spores.
Yeah, they have male and female spores. Okay, so this sporophyte is making spores by meiosis. It's making the male spores in the anther. Okay, so inside the anther are sporangia that make these microspores. Inside the female parts here, the carpel, they make spores. Okay, like I said, sporophytes make spores by meiosis. So inside here, they make a megaspore, just shown in the middle there. And the megaspore stays in the ovary. Okay. All right. Spores grow up to be gametophytes. So these microspores will grow up to be a pollen grain or a male gametophyte. And I don't think this picture does a good job of showing this, but this microspore growing up to be a male gametophyte actually still happens within the anther. Okay. Here's the female megaspore that grows up to be a megagametophyte or a female gametophyte, and so this blue part grows and grows, and it kind of fills this whole inside area here. Okay? All right, gametophytes make gametes by mitosis. So here's the male gametophyte, also known as a piece of pollen. It doesn't make the gametes until it lands on top of the female carpel right here. And so then it makes two sperm by mitosis that go down there. And then here is the female gametophyte in blue, and it makes an egg here by mitosis. So that one right there is the egg. All right, so eventually the sperm will go all the way down around the bottom and up the top to where the egg is. Okay, and so then here's two sperm coming. So sperm plus egg, or gamete plus gamete, equals zygote. So now here's your fertilized zygote right there. And other details we'll get to in a minute. The other sperm will go up here and fertilize this big cell in the center. And then the zygote, there's your little zygote, grows up to be a new sporophyte. So the zygote, right there, grows up to be this little seedling inside here. So this is the outside of the ovary. And then here's the little seedling. And the seed will land somewhere, and then the seedling will grow into a new sporophyte. Okay, so that's like the bones of the cycle. There's some more details that we have to talk about, though. All right, so before we go on, let's just make sure we got our vocabulary right. So which of these structures represent gametophytes? Are sperm and egg gametophytes?
No, those are gametes.
Yeah. What about pollen and the embryo sac?
Yeah, well, the pollen's a gametophyte, and if you call that like blue circle an embryo sac, that's a gametophyte.
Okay, good. What about on a flower, the petals and the carpels?
No, that's part of the sporophyte, I guess. Yeah.
What about the ovaries and the anthers?
That's still part of the sporophyte.
What about the roots, the stems, and the leaves?
Those are still part of the sporophyte.
All right. So it's just the pollen and the embryo sac that represent the gametophyte. All right, so here's a flower, which you've probably seen before. So before the flower, when the flower is still in bud form and it has these green leaves covering and protecting it, those little specialized green leaves are called sepals. And then the petals are the more delicate, brightly colored kind of structures on the inside. Those are used as advertisement to pollinators to come over and basically pollinate this flower. And so they could be brightly colored, they could be scented as well. All right, so the stamens are the male parts. So that's this anther on a filament. That's a stamen. And up here in the anther, that's where the pollen is produced. The carpel, that's this part over here, is the female reproductive organs. And so the carpel has three parts. It has a stigma, so that's the tip where the pollen lands. It has a style, that's the neck, and then the ovary, where the ovules are that will mature into eggs. So there's variation in types of flowers. So you can have plants that are monoecious, and they have separate stamen and carpel producing flowers on the same individual. So for example, on corn, the male flowers are on the top and the female flowers are on the side. Excuse me. Some plants can have flowers that are, or some plants can be dioecious, like cannabis, for example. There's a male plant that produces the male, like the pollen and stuff, and a female plant that produces female flowers with ovules. So all the pictures we show you are showing you, kind of flowers that have male and female parts all together, but not all flowers are that way. All right, let's talk about more details about angiosperm reproduction. All right, so we talked about that the megasporophytes make megaspores, right? So here we have the sporophyte, and then here's the female organs. And so if we look in more detail, this structure here is called a megasporangium, okay? And this is going to make megaspores, so it's going to make four. Three of them will degenerate, just leaving the one, okay? And then the megaspores grow up to be female gametophytes, which is this egg sac here, okay, or the embryo sac. And the female gametophyte is going to contain 7 cells, okay? So we have here, so 7 cells with 8 nuclei. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 nuclei. 1, 2, 3, 4. This big one in the middle is 4. 5, 6, 7 cells, okay? All right, and so these have names. You should check the study guide that I've put up. I kind of went through and figured out which words you need to know and which words you don't need to know. Definitely need to know this is the egg here. The 2 on the side are called synergids, and then this one in the middle with 2 nuclei. The nuclei from the center cell are called the polar nuclei. Okay. All right, this is what's going on in the anthers. So the microsporophytes in here are making microspores. Okay, so here's a microspore, and then the microspores will grow up to be the male gametophytes, which is a pollen grain. And the male gametophyte will contain 2 cells, a cell called a generative cell and another cell called the tube cell. So this is the cell that will give rise to the tube that, it forms to get all the way down through the flower into the female organs, and then this is the cell that will, or this is the cell that will make the sperm to go up the tube. Okay, so one thing we should point out is that there is a difference between pollination and fertilization. So pollination just refers to when you have the pollen moving from the anther to the stigma. So from the male place where the pollen is made to the stigma where it's going to make a pollen tube and go down and access the ovule. Okay. Fertilization is when the sperm and the egg come together to form a diploid zygote. So those two things are separated in time and space. It takes this gametophyte, or the pollen, a long time to work this tube all the way down and all the way around here, and then send the sperm through those tubes, through that tube, so that it can meet up with the egg. We've talked about self-fertilization or selfing a little bit, but just to remind you that this can happen when the sperm and the egg from the same individual combine to produce offspring. They don't have to be from the same flower, really. It could just be an individual with two different flowers, and the pollen from one of the flowers lands on the female organs of the other flower. Outcrossing is more common, so this is when the sperm and the eggs from different individuals combine. And there's lots of different mechanisms that plants use to be able to make it more likely that outcrossing will occur than self-fertilization. All right, so this is what fertilization looks like. So first the pollen grain lands on the flower stigma and it germinates, means it starts growing. Sometimes if you have a species that's self-incompatible, there's a mechanism in place to prevent the plant from reproducing with itself. That step may be blocked, so the pollen may land, but it may not be able to germinate. All right, step 2, the pollen tube grows all the way down through the stigma and through the style, and then that generative cell divides to form 2 sperm, which it sends down there. So here's your pollen tube, here's the nucleus of the tube cell, and then here's the 2 sperm that came from the generative cell. All right, step 3, the pollen tube gets all the way down here and it reaches that little hole at the bottom called the micropyle and grows through it, and then it enters a synergid within the female gametophyte, and then the synergid degenerates and the 2 sperm are released. So there's the synergid that degenerated. One of the sperm goes over here to fertilize the egg, and the other sperm goes over here to fertilize this big kind of the 2 polar nuclei for the big cell in the middle. So this is called double fertilization, 2 sperm, 2 fertilization events, okay? You can notice that this middle part over here, that used to have the polar nuclei, is now triploid, right? It has 2 nuclei, 2 female nuclei, and then 1 male nuclei or 2 female, nuclei fuse with the 1 male nucleus from the sperm, and then they form a triploid tissue called endosperm. And this is what forms the kind of nutritive tissue that helps to nourish the egg when it's growing. Okay. I believe I said that. All right. Animal pollination is mutually beneficial between the pollinator and the flower. So the pollinator benefits because it's getting food. Sometimes it is eating some of the pollen. Sometimes it is retrieving nectar from way down inside of the flower. And then the flowering plant will benefit by outcrossing because the insect can, or the bird or whatever it is, or beetle, can carry pollen from one plant to another plant. So flowers and pollinators have co-evolved with one another. So all flowers have evolved these adaptations that increase the probability that a pollinator is going to visit them, and pollinators have developed adaptations that increase how much nutrition they can get from visiting the flowers. And so we call this kind of situation where you get flower characteristics that very closely match the pollinator characteristics, pollination syndromes. And so you get this kind of flower color, shapes, and scents that attract very specific pollinators. So for example, you have plants that are pollinated by bats, and those plants tend to have very strong smells, and they're light colored, and they don't have any particular color pattern on them or anything like that because it's nighttime. You have plants like this one over here with an extremely long spur, and at the bottom there is a nectary that's making nectar, and so it would take something with an extremely long proboscis like this moth to be able to get down in there. So there's been coevolution between this moth and this flower, as the flower tries to get the moth to linger longer and longer, to pick up more and more pollen, and then the moth has evolved a longer and longer proboscis to be able to get nectar more and more efficiently. All right, so pollination evolved late in the history of land plant evolution. Dog, do you have something you need to say?
No, I'm just barking. I don't know why.
All right. So we can see here, these are all the land plants, and pollination occurs here. Well, pollen occurs here. This is when we first see pollen. And so pollen is distributed in a bunch of different ways throughout the gymnosperms. It is usually by wind or by some combination of wind and animals. But angiosperms have evolved this kind of a system where mostly their pollen is spread by animals. So there has been coevolution between the pollinators and the flowers, which, flowers are only in the angiosperms. And we can see that both in the behavior and the, morphology of the pollinators, but also flower size and shape has also changed in response. All right, here's a problem. An ovary contains 20 ovules. How many pollen grains are required for all 20 ovules to develop into viable seeds with embryos and endosperm? All right, let's see. First choice, only 10, since each pollen tube produces 2 sperm. 40, since double fertilization requires 2 pollen to fertilize each embryo sac. Only 1, since pollen tubes can release more than 1 sperm. 20, since each pollen tube releases 2 sperm. Only 2, since one pollen tube will release sperm and the other will release eggs. All right, what do you guys think?
Let's see. If you've got 20 ovules, well, you'll need at least 20 sperm.
Okay. Do you need more than 20 sperm?
Well, yeah, I guess you have to fertilize the polar nuclei too.
Okay. So, how many sperm do you need to do that?
Just like 1 for each plant.
Okay, so what is that total?
I can't do math on a dog.
Somebody help the dog? Yeah, that would be like, you need 40 sperm total. But
that generative cell makes 2 sperm, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It makes a tube cell and it makes 2 sperm, right?
So, you only need the same number of pollen grains that you need as ovules, right?
Yeah, I think that is the right answer. Yep. So 20. So if you have 20 ovules, you need 20 pollen grains. Each pollen grain will produce 2 sperm. One fertilizes the ovule and one fertilizes the endosperm, right? The polar nuclei, which develop into endosperm. Cool?
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Okay, so let's talk about seeds and fruits. As the seed matures, the embryo and the endosperm will develop inside the ovule and become surrounded by a seed coat. Okay? At the same time, around the outside of the seed coat, the ovary will develop into a fruit, right? So the seeds are inside of the fruit. And the fruit will protect the seeds, but also maybe it will help to disperse the seeds somewhere else. So maybe some animal will come eat the fruit.
I volunteer!
Okay? And will take that seed far away. So the seed will contain the stored nutrients so that when it lands on the ground, the offspring will be able to succeed even if the environment is crowded and if it takes a little while for the plant to be able to gather nutrients of its own. So monocots have 1 cotyledon, while dicots have 2 cotyledons. So cotyledons are the name of the first kind of fleshy leaf that forms. So this is a bean seed. It's a eudicot. So it has these kind of 2, 1 on each side. And then the corn seed is a monocot. And yeah, it only just has the 1 cotyledon. So in most eudicots, the cotyledons take up nutrients from the endosperm and then store them. Okay, so as the fruit, matures, the walls of the ovary are going to thicken to form the pericarp. So that's the part of the fruit that surrounds and protects the seeds. And so, I mean, the fruit provides cushioning, but also, and so it prevents like seed predators, little mice or something that might come to eat the highly nutritious seed from getting at it. But it also allows the seed to be dispersed. So, whoa. So a bigger animal may come by and eat the fruit, and then it will go poop somewhere, and then the seed will land probably like completely unchewed on or harmed in any way on top of this pile of poop. So it will help the seed have a good place to grow. There's different kinds of fruits. You can have simple fruit. So like a cherry, you know how there's one pit in the middle, right? So this is a single carpel. All right, so this is a flower with a single carpel in the middle, and down at the bottom there is the ovary, right, with one ovule in it. And the ovule will grow up into the seed, and then the pericarp will form around that, right? So each cherry is from a single flower, okay? You also have aggregate fruits. So it develops from a single flower with separate carpels. So if you look down the middle, you can see there's a whole bunch of these yellow thingies here. Those are each carpels that each have an ovary at the bottom, okay? And so those all get fertilized, and then you end up making, each one of those little ovaries makes a separate little blackberry with its own little seed in it. You can also have a plant like a pineapple that's multiple fruit, and so each of these sections is its own flower with many carpels in it, okay? So there's lots of modifications on fruit. All right, when the seed lands, we say that it germinates, meaning it grows. And as I mentioned before, with eudicots and monocot embryos, the radicle or the embryonic root emerges first, and then eventually, after it starts to be able to kind of suck up moisture, it will develop into the more mature root system later. Okay, in eudicots, the shoot system and the cotyledons come soon after the radicle or this kind of baby root appears. It looks like this. So we have the two cotyledons on either side. Okay. In monocots, the shoot as it's coming up is covered by a protective coleoptile, like this. There it is. And then once the cotyledons or the first leaves begin photosynthesis, then the young plant doesn't really need the cotyledons, the original kind of cotyledons anymore, and so they'll kind of dry up and fall off. All right, so hopefully in this chapter, you learned that reproduction and development are key to the success of flowering plants. We talked about sexual versus asexual reproduction, reproductive structures, pollination and fertilization, seeds and embryos, vegetative development. We talked about flowering plants, how pollination and fertilization involves animals and wind to move pollen from flower to flower. We talked about reproductive development. All right, the end.